is Pashmina P. from the desk of the Online Authors Office, founder and CEO. And I am here with Jason Masters, one of our Master Elite authors. Jason, how are you? Can you tell us where you're dialing in from, please?
Hi, Pashmina. Great to speak with you and your audience again. So I'm dialing in from just over the Sydney Harbour Bridge in Sydney.
It's wonderful.
There's a lot today.
Thank you for being with us and, having this opportunity for some of our audience to meet you. So let's get right into the questions, because there's so many of us who have these, burning questions that we want to ask you and get to know more about this new book that's coming out. So what inspired you to write your book?
I think coming out as a gay man late in life after being married, one of the things I was trying to find resources, not only for myself, for my then wife and for my children. And I found a whole lot of, I suppose, theological reflections, which were very, very helpful. I saw some books about people's coming out, but there was only one book I saw in the Australian market, at least, of a gay man who was a religious leader who was married to a woman coming out late in life. And so that sort of made me start to think, is there a bit of a gap in the market? And then people started to encourage me, and so things rolled on from there.
That's wonderful. And tell us more about the process of coming out and writing the book, because it's been a labor of love. I mean, the OAO have been with you. I've known you for 6 years, and we've watched the progression. And how was this process of coming out through the book? How has it been?
So I think the process through the book has been quite interesting. So I'd already come out. I'd come out to my then wife, my children, and to a whole lot of my friends. I think then the process started of, why was I writing this story? And originally I thought I would just write a PDF it and put it on a website and add to it that way. I'd not spoken at that point in time about my story publicly, but I was invited to be as a speaker on a panel in Hong Kong for the Asia Pacific Rainbow Family Forum. So I went up there and was speaking with two other wonderful people, a transgender woman from the South Pacific and a gay Muslim who was working in Fiji at that point in time. And so I told part of my story. It was quite emotional, and got a lot of support from them, got a lot of support from the audience. But afterwards, an author that Julie Hansford, came up to me. She was there as a teacher. She had some LGBTQ plus students at the conference, and she said, "You've got to write your story," and put me in touch with you. And as they say, the rest is history.
It's wonderful. There's a very religious part of your book, and you are a man of faith. I mean, I've known you for a while, and, we always talk about religion and God and the universe, which has been some very wonderful and profound experiences discussing those matters with you. How has this played an integral role in your life, and how has this affected your story and your journey as an author?
I think in a number of ways. I think when you look at all of the great faiths, mine is Christianity. I mentioned a colleague of mine is the Islamic faith. There's Hindus, there's Buddhists, and many others. There can be a tension between those communities of faith and the LGBTIQ plus people. And I think, for me, I'd already been on what we might call in the Christianity, the more progressive side. But what was interesting is the lead up to coming out, I actually started to feel less and less accepting of LGBTIQ people. And I remember we were heading into the vote on same-sex marriage in Australia, lead up to that process actually happening, and my then wife saying, "Oh, you'd be supportive of that." And I found myself oh, I'm not sure, which was very odd from my own theological perspective. And often people who are of faith will say they actually become, in a sense, a little bit more homophobic as they start to get closer and closer to coming out. So this story for me then starts to bring together a number of the different aspects of my life that might have played into those sort of issues around how I might have reacted to certain situations. And then from writing the story, I've then become an advocate for LGBTIQ rights. So one of the things I'm often doing now is writing submissions to various parliaments around Australia around proposed legislation and its inappropriateness to the LGBTIQ community, and even have written stuff internationally. There's a big inquiry going on in the United Kingdom around transgender youth and the health services for that, and there's a big push to withdraw health services for transgender youth. So I, for one of the organisations I co-lead, have actually written a submission to that review saying transgender youth need all the support they should get, and this attempt to withdraw some of that support is actually inappropriate.
Wow, that's very interesting. And I mean, that brings me to the next question, because I mean, it is about putting all the pieces of the puzzle together. And your book really does talk about finding those pieces of the puzzle. What does that mean to you? And can you explain more to your audience how you did that, like in order to get this book out, and of course your upcoming workbook out?
Yes. So there are a number of different pieces. There's who am I?
Mm-hmm.
Who am I authentically? And I actually wrote a LinkedIn article last week around being an authentic leader. And if you can't be your authentic self, it's very hard to be an authentic leader. So one of the processes of writing this book has actually helped me become a more authentic leader.
Mm-hmm.
And that was also helped by the fact that I was fortunate enough to go to Stanford University for an LGBTIQ executive leadership course, which really challenged me to be an authentic leader. But even that took a while to come through. So I think there's who am I? Can I accept myself? How do I deal with the shame of not being who I am and the shame of pain I might have caused others? So they're all part of it. I think the other thing is, what are the family contexts that you don't understand? My father was one of the youngest people in the Navy at the end of World War II. He was on the battleship of Australia, HMAS Australia, the first ship ever hit by kamikazes. In the second round of attacks, he was injured. They got hit by 5 kamikazes in 3 days. But there's been very little written about what is such an important story of military history for Australia. And I eventually found a book written by a very famous Australian journalist called Mike Carlton, and I just need to get the title right. His book's called Flagship, the Cruise of HMAS Australia 2 and the Pacific War in Japan. And in that, I discovered that just before my father joined the ship as a 17, 18-year-old man, there was a murder on the ship of a man who was going to out 2 gay people. And on ships, there's all sorts of spiritual things that happen, and people get very nervous about murders and all those sort of things. And now I just wonder what impact that had on my father as it impacted his way of dealing with me when he first saw me involved with a young boy, as a young boy myself.
Yeah, but we try not to be defined by our past, and we try not to, like, dwell on former circumstances in order to move forward. But sometimes we can't change other people's mindsets. We have to like you said in an earlier conversation, that you tried not to walk on eggshells around him, but how would you change his perspective? I think that was his own piece of the puzzle that he needed to get together. Your book is based on your true life story, and you touch on family issues, which you did briefly just now about your father. Tell us more about how your families and your friendships and redefining yourself affected those around you, but also how did it affect you?
So I think there's been a lot of mental health because I couldn't be who I was. I suffered quite a lot of emotional abuse as a child, teenager, and young man from my father. And I actually have chosen not to go into detail about that in the book, but there are kind of insights into what was happening. I think the first thing was in dealing with my own mental health was I struggled to really accept that emotional abuse is a real thing. I could understand sexual abuse, I could understand physical abuse, but it took me a long time to accept that emotional abuse was actually something that existed. And even with my therapist at the time, who kept saying to me, yours is the worst form of emotional abuse I've dealt with in over 30 years, I still was struggling to accept it. So, these are some of the challenges you go on with. I think from there, coming out has a whole lot of challenges. Have I been living a lie? Have I been lying to people? And so there is this whole concept of shame that you have to deal with. And I think working through writing this book helped me deal with some of that. I think for me, I'm hoping that for people, they will find through the challenges of the story an element of hope. Because as I was forced out to a number of people, their immediate reaction was, oh, I didn't see that one coming, but we need to catch up quickly. The next day I had coffee with a warrant officer I'd known at that point in time for 18 years, warrant officer in the Australian Army. He'd never mentioned that he had a gay uncle and a lesbian auntie. And so that allowed a different form of conversation. And the military often does have some challenges with LGBTIQ people because, they weren't allowed in the military for so many years. But he was absolutely affirming and, wanted nothing to change. Another friend of mine who's a very dear friend and Christian, also a leader in the church, it was, we're going out for dinner, we're going to have lots of red wine. And the next day I had a very sore head. But, again, very, very supportive and encouraging. There's been support. I think, one of the things my psychologist, we have talked about through this process is when my book comes out, which is, really soon, there will be some who might use it as an opportunity to attack me. And so there's a level of preparation I'm doing for those who are very conservative, politically or theologically, who may see this as another attack on their historical preference of how the world order should be.
So besides that, feeling that maybe there's some people that needed your consent, you needed their consent, and like opening up your universe as this new authority, and also opening up your new coaching, parameters and advocating for humanity. What has been the most challenging process in writing your book?
I think there were a number. I think the first thing I didn't understand when you're writing a memoir, the need for consent. Anybody who is identified or identifiable needs to give their consent to the book. So my ex-wife, she's a very private person. She really had a whole lot of issues with this. And this is where your organisation and your colleagues were so valuable in being an intermediary between the two of us to negotiate for her to give consent for the book. She wanted a number of editorial changes, which we agreed with. But that was very hard. For me, this story is very important. for her, she wanted privacy, and so there was a great conflict. I think the other thing was there were some legal issues in consent. One of the chapters of the book, which is a core part of the book, involves a national church meeting, like the parliament of the church, my church in Australia, my denomination. And some things that happened to me in that meeting that triggered a very traumatic episode for me had been leaked. And so I thought, having it been leaked, even though those sessions were confidential, that I could talk about it. But when the church were reviewing the book for their consent, they said, well, yes, others might have leaked it, but you still have an obligation and you can't talk about certain things. And that was one of the things that slowed the book up, because whilst I actually wrote that traumatic experience very quickly, the process of then having to rewrite it to get I suppose the depth of what happened in that meeting to cause the reaction that happened to make sense was very traumatic. It re-traumatized me, actually having to live through that event multiple times to try and work out how I could tell it so it would make sense to the reader, but I had to exclude the part that actually told the trigger of what happened. We got there in the end, but that just delayed me for months and months and actually caused, as I said, some trauma in doing that. So I think they were probably the two most challenging aspects of writing the book.
You got over it, which was wonderful. And we watched you have to go through that, which was a little bit painful for us on our side, because there was really nothing that we could do in terms of, as much legalities that we could bring to the table for you, because these are very sensitive issues that deal with the church, first of all, and second of all, a family member. So it was mostly kind of like settling outside of those legal understandings, which I think you did really well, which is why you have this power, to coach people into understanding that, yes, there are roadblocks, but how do you get through it is, with a little bit understanding, calmness, and knowing that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, which is wonderful. What is a piece of advice you can give your audience when it comes to revealing your story, especially one as raw as yours? I mean, advocating for humanity, as you have mentioned before, is for the minorities. I mean, some of those stories might be heart-wrenching and heart-ripping and, maybe do need consent. So what is that one piece of advice that you can give your audience about writing their own story?
So I think the advice I'm going to be giving people is the great advice you gave me. When I started the process, I thought, and I suppose coming from a management consulting background, I'm writing a report. So I've got to have an executive summary, I've got to have a context, a scope of work, and then I've got to outline how I get to my conclusion. And I was very constrained by that mindset, and it was actually stopping me from doing things. And you said to me, Jason, just write. Don't worry about where it is in the story. We'll piece it together at the end. And I remember you saying there are different ways memoirs can be compiled. Now, mine, apart from the first chapter, is relatively linear, but they don't have to be linear. And so I found it very empowering to actually just, an image might come into my head or a part of my story came into my head, and I would just sit down and write that element. And that then freed me up to not be constrained by any model of what this story might ultimately look like. It came together quite naturally just by getting it all down on paper. I think the other thing for myself, again, having a management consulting mindset, but also then, as often with LGBTIQ plus people with shame, is actually finding your voice. And my first few chapters I wrote, they had content, but they didn't tell a story.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the editor you had with me on the sort of the chapter part of this was really struggling to try and work out, well, how do we actually write this so it's nice to read? And I can't remember what happened, and I don't know if you can, but something happened, and my writing style dramatically changed, and my voice came out. And one of the things we've had to put in the introduction, which was actually some feedback from the author of the only other book of this style in Australia, Anthony Ben Brown, was, I didn't expect that language in your book, Jason.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not a lot of bad language, but there is more language than people would normally expect coming out of my mouth. And I think that helps people understand the authenticity and I suppose the challenges that people going through my experience go through.
I think that's what it is. I think it was the ability, I was about to say that, to be authentic, not just only to prove yourself to the outside world, but be authentic to yourself, like to take the responsibility to actually reflect. And like you said, just write anything. I mean, a writer, this is what I tell my authors, a writer must write every day. There's some writing that I will never, ever show the world. I mean, I write it and burn it after it because it's just like, that's what was that, but just that practice of being authentic with yourself, I think, is very, very important. And that's great advice. So we're running out of time, and I just wanted to ask about advocating for humanity. I know that this is your new program and something that you're going to be helping with other people to let them get their voice out there. And can you let us know more about this and your book as a business card, and tell us a little bit more about how the two work together?
So Journey Towards Acceptance just started as my story. And I think as you and I talked and others talked, we recognize that it is an important part of the stories that need to be out there. And so one of the things I'm going to be making myself available for is to provide sort of mentoring services to people who might have read this book and want to work through things. So that's one thing. We're currently working on a workbook to come out a little later on, which will allow people to read the book and then do some personal self-reflection on it. I think the book has two really useful but different audiences. There's the LGBTIQ community and people who are perhaps coming out. It might give them some anchor points to hold on to and some hope at the end. And then for people who aren't part of the LGBTIQ community, I hope it'll inspire them to become allies to our community, because certainly the way things are happening around the world with significant anti-LGBTIQ plus activities happening in the UK and America and other places at the moment, we need to activate allies to support the community. So there's that. Then also being a company director, I'm hoping that there might be boards who might ask me to come speak to them about advocacy work, about inclusion, acceptance of people, and also to speak at corporate events, things like that. And then finally, Advocating for Humanity is a new small publishing house where we're going to focus on, as you said, the minority groups, be they people with disabilities, be they other LGBTIQ people, be they refugees, be they of a religious minority in a country that's being oppressed for their faith. So that's we're going to have a tight niche, but it's all about trying to get the perhaps unheard story out, because yes, there are some really good stories out there, but there's never enough. And the more we get these stories out, I think the better society can be.
And that's wonderful. You're allowing these minorities to have a voice, which is so remarkable. And thank you so much for joining us today, Jason. That was so informative. And I can't wait to hold your book in our hands. It's been 6 wonderful years, and it's just the beautiful beginning. And we look forward to hearing more about the workbook and all the media opportunities that you'll be receiving for both your new company and for your book. Thanks a lot, Jason. Speak soon.
Thanks, Pashmina. Look forward to it. Bye-bye.